Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to Bioshock Infinite in Retrospective, where we're going to sort of talk about it, review it a little bit, and sort of discuss why I like this game and why I think that you should probably go get it if it's the sort of thing that you would like. And of course, you know, if this doesn't sound like the sort of thing that you would like, then probably shouldn't get it, that's just sort of reasonable. Now, Bioshock Infinite is one of those big title games that drew a lot of attention from a lot of sides on this, and I think that there were a lot of people on both sides of whether it was the best game ever and the worst game ever or something in between. I think they had a lot of interesting things to say on both sides. Obviously, I'm of the camp that this is a good game, so you know, you don't have to sort of listen to this if you think that I'm wrong, but the thing I have to say right off the bat is that the people who dislike this game have every right to have said that they dislike it. When you go into a game like this, there are certain expectations and there are certain sort of things that you're going to be looking for. And depending on what those things are, Bioshock Infinite can be dramatically more disappointing than you would hope it was. On the alternative, if you're looking for the things that this game does provide, it becomes one of the most brilliant games that you could ever find. So really, this is a game where whatever you're expecting going into it, that will inform your opinion of the entire game. So, jumping into the review, I'd like to talk about the strongest point of the game first and what the game arguably is about. I'd like to talk a little bit about the characters of this game. So, this game is a very sort of human game. It's a human story. It's about Booker and Elizabeth. That's the main element of the storyline here. So the strength of the characters here, the strength of the way that Booker and Elizabeth and the Lutece twins and everyone else are written is what this game is focused on, and that's a very difficult line to balance on because characters have to sort of convey certain things. They need to be, if they're a protagonist, you have to like them to a certain degree, or for example, and they have to have strong specific character traits. This is something that I think that a lot of games aren't willing to do these days. Even a game like Deus Ex, I felt had fairly weak characters to allow Adam Jensen the degree of freedom that he required for you as the player to express all those different ways that he could behave. This game doesn't allow that for Booker. Booker is a specifically written character. He is a man with all these specific backstory traits. He acts the way he acts, and you can't change who he is because he is a specific person. He's not a blank slate character. And a lot of games are unwilling to do this. They're very dead set on stating that, you know, you can play this guy however you want. Booker is a man from the 7th Cavalry. He fought at Wounded Knee. He was part of the genocide and was actually a fairly enthusiastic part of the genocide that took place there. He then went on to the Pinkertons, where he would have done things like finding leaders of labor unions and broken their kneecaps or threatened them and their families. And that is the sort of character that Booker DeWitt is. And that doesn't leave a lot open to interpretation for how he solves problems. That is who he is. He solves things through violence. And he is a character who is sort of repentant about that to a certain degree, but doesn't believe in repentance, so he continues on as he is in his sort of misery and guilt. And that is the character of Booker, and he goes to this sort of city in the hopes that he can just do another job, and it evolves into the way the story unfolds. And I think that that is much more compelling than saying that here's your guy, he is whatever, do whatever you want with him. I think that not enough games actually have a main character. I think most games are just willing to throw you a guy with a few basic traits and then a few snarky one-liners and call that a character. I don't actually really agree with that. Elizabeth as well is exceptionally well written for the most part. You know, she has her own sort of wants. She has what she believes in, and it changes. The game changes who she is as things go on. You know, by the end of it, she's, you know, seen some shit, and that's understandable. And I think that that has sort of an influence on what she believes and what she wants. It starts off very simple. She just wants to go see Paris. I mean, that's as simple a desire as you can want. But by the end of things, that's, you know, the world's not so simple anymore. And I think that that sort of change in her character and what she believes in and what she thinks and what she wants, I think those are all very interesting things. I think that makes it a very sort of human story, that sort of growth and development of somebody who in a more traditional game would have probably just been an escort MacGuffin that you have to make sure gets from one end of the level to the other. They didn't do that with Elizabeth, and I'm very glad that they didn't. And other characters in this game, the Lutece twins were brilliantly written. They're hilarious. They're a riot. They're always fun to watch. They don't ever explain as much as I think that you would expect someone like them to do. They're just basically trolls, and I think that actually fits who they are very perfectly. And I think that sort of attitude that they have about the whole thing, I think that's just very well acted out. And how they sort of intertwine into the story, they never explain how they intertwine into the story and how they direct everything and what they're doing there. I think that's sort of all fairly brilliant, especially I don't know, they're just probably my favorite characters in this game. Just their attitude about everything, their lines, their dialogue, their performance, it's all very well done. Other characters in this game, even the ones that aren't really elaborated upon, such as Daisy Fitzroy, is not that well focused on in this game. I think that they're decent characters. They're secondary characters, so they're definitely not as well fleshed out as Booker DeWitt, for instance. But even Fitzroy, her motivations, what she wanted in life, who she was before all this happened. I thought that it was very interesting how she was before everything sort of changed for her, how she actually liked Lady Comstock. I thought that was actually fairly interesting. I thought that her life before that, I think that feeling that she must have felt when she was cast out of and branded as a traitor, she must have felt incredibly betrayed. I think that is what motivated her more than her desire for justice. I think that it's that feeling like, she used to belong with Comstock and Lady Comstock. I think she felt that she really had a place there. And I think that sort of betrayal when she was cast out and branded as a traitor, I think that motivated her far more strongly than the ideas of revolution and the ideas of toppling Comstock. I think that makes her a very nuanced character, and I think that's that change, that difference between her and everyone else in the revolution, I think is what makes her an interesting leader for them, since I don't think she's leading them for the same reasons that they're following. Comstock himself, I think, is fairly interesting. I think that he's doing what he's doing because he believes that it'll help sort of atone for his past to a certain degree. Now that he's a new man, I think that he's sort of gone that sort of route, and he believes that these portals, these terrors, are sort of a divine gift that he's supposed to use to predict the future and then do as they essentially command, I think. So I think that there are a lot of interesting characters, and I think that their explanations for why they're doing what they're doing is fairly well elaborated upon in this game, and I think that makes it the biggest strength of this game. And moving on from that, we get into the setting, which is, I think, what a lot of people were hoping would be the strongest point of this game. They would, when we get into Columbia, it looks fantastic. It looks like it's going to be another Rapture, that beautiful city in the sky. And I think that a lot of people went into this game thinking it was going to be a similar game to Rapture, to the original Bioshock. And I think that if you were looking for that, you might be a little bit disappointed in this game, because as beautiful as Columbia is, as atmospheric as each of the sections is in portraying a sort of feeling, be it squalor, be it opulence, be it sort of peace, be it anything, it doesn't really have the same sort of feel as Rapture did. It doesn't have the story of Rapture. It's not the focus of the world like Rapture was. It's simply the backdrop to the story about the characters of Booker DeWitt, about Elizabeth, about the Lutece twins, about Comstock. That's what the city of Columbia is. And I think that it can be a weakness to this game, especially for people who really, really enjoyed the first Bioshock. And I think that could be construed as a mark against it. For me, I think that it was still a beautiful enough city, and I think it was still an atmospheric enough city that it is still stronger than pretty much any other game out there right now in terms of the way that everything's designed. I think that this game is very well portrayed in that regard. So I think that the city of Columbia and the setting is still very strong. It's just not as strong as the original Bioshock. And I think that the way it's intertwined with the story is a little bit weaker than the way Rapture was the focus of the story in the original Bioshock. But to a certain degree, I think there has to be some concessions from the narrative about making it a less important part of it so that they can more heavily focus on the characters. I do feel that quite strongly. Next, talking about the story in general, like I said, this is a story about Booker DeWitt and Elizabeth. This is about a man trying to find sort of a means to rescue a person, and then realize much later on that it was far more personal than he had ever imagined, and to sort of make amends for the things that he'd done that he thought that he could never atone for, and to atone for things that he hadn't even done. I think that that's what the story is essentially about. I think that, you know, it's about Elizabeth being the person who could bring him to there, and save herself in the process. If you looked at the scene after the credits, Elizabeth saves herself from ever becoming Elizabeth. She remains Anna DeWitt at the end of the things because she stops Comstock from ever taking her. And I think that you know, in helping Booker find that sort of redemption, she finds a means by which she saves herself. And I think that that sort of is a really interesting part of the story. And I think that that sort of motivation, even if it's not explicit, I think is a really interesting one. And I do like that this story is very character-driven. I think that it's much more interesting to listen to a human story rather than a story about a setting or about things that happen to certain people, even if the people aren't important. So I do think that that side of the story is very good. On the other side of the coin, running parallel to that story is a story about Columbia. Now, the story about Columbia is not the story that we're experiencing. We're experiencing parts of it where the paths of Booker and Elizabeth intertwine with the story about Columbia, but the story about Columbia is one about the politics, about the rebellion, about the Vox Populi versus the wealthy elite. It's a story about Comstock against the oppressed masses. It's about the city of Columbia itself, right? And that's just not what we're there to experience. So while it's there, it's running sort of parallel, and there's a lot that we miss because of that. And I happen to think that, you know, they could have definitely done more to make it obvious that there was that sort of world behind their going on, but they've done quite a lot as it was, so I'm not sure if that's necessary. All I know is that it wasn't as strong or compelling a story as the one about Booker DeWitt and about Elizabeth. So that's, you know, parallel story is there as a backdrop. It's basically the background, and it's a very fleshed out, moving background that is a story in its own right. But it's not what the story is about. So I don't think it's overly worth fretting about it. If you went into this game, again, expecting it to be like Bioshock, where it was a story about the world, it can potentially be disappointing. It feels like it's a much weaker story than the story for the original Bioshock was if you approach it in that particular direction. But if you are sort of cognizant of the fact that this is supposed to be a human story, a story about Booker DeWitt and Elizabeth, then it's going to be a much more enjoyable narrative experience, I feel. So it really depends if you're looking for certain things in the story, and that will profoundly influence how you experience the story. And this is something I forgot to say. I probably should have talked about earlier when I was talking about the setting. I talking about the sound a little bit. Jumping all over the place here. The sound in this game was pretty atmospheric. It was not out in the forefront very often. It was there. The music, I'm aware, was there. But I don't really remember much of it. I remember it sort of being in the background, and listening back on it, I do think it sort of enhanced whatever it was that was going on the screen. So in that regard, I think that the music was very successful. The music that sort of sticks out at you is the music that is one of the more pop culture-y things, the sort of Easter eggs. But at the same time, those Easter eggs, for example, Girls Just Want to Have Fun or whatever, those songs actually hint at parts of the plot about what is going on behind the scenes in Rapture. Like, you know the name Fink. It's his, Albert Fink, I think was his name. He's that musician who's been stealing music from our world to put it into the world of Bioshock. And I think that should have informed part of the plot about this world. And it should be telling you very early on that, these guys are doing something strange. There's something strange going on here. And I think that you should be able to piece together, for example, why there are vigors in the world based on that information that you've got there. So not only is it pretty neat to be able to listen to, for example, the Beach Boys being sung in barbershop quartet style, I think that's a lot of fun and it sounds pretty interesting. Not only is that interesting, musically and as a sort of fun thing, it is actually very relevant to the plot, and it should be informing a lot about the way the world works, and I think that's quite interesting. So I think that was very well managed. moving on a little bit, this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, and that's the mechanics of the game. The mechanics of this game needs to be broken up a little bit by difficulty, because the way the game plays is exceptionally different on 1999 mode as compared to normal. And in normal mode, all you really need to worry about is whether or not you're simply having fun with it. I mean, there's nothing really that's too challenging. You can play it however you want. You can use whatever vigors you want for whatever situation. You can use whichever guns you want. You can use melee if you'd like. Everything works, and I think that makes the game a lot more dynamic. It makes it a lot more flowing, and it makes it a lot more fun. In 1999 mode, and to a lesser extent hard mode, you need to be using the right vigor on the right targets. You need to be using the specific guns that are good in this game, or switching out if you're out of ammunition only. But basically, 1999 mode is a very slow, deliberate, tactical game. It's not about run and gun sort of action-y sort of stuff. Whereas basically in normal mode, you are essentially a swashbuckling sky pirate. That's how it feels. That's how it should feel. And that is a lot of fun. The mechanics of the game are very good at reinforcing that idea that you're sort of this cutlass between the teeth, pistol in each hand kind of guy. Although I guess I can't really recommend that you swing around on a rope with a pistol in each hand. But you feel like you're that kind of person, and it feels very sort of space opera-y, except a little bit less high up. You're only in upper atmosphere or whatever. So it becomes this sort of very grand adventure-y feel, whereas it feels a lot more gritty on 1999 mode. And I think that ultimately, if you want a challenge, if you want a sort of tactical shooter game, Bioshock is not really a great game for that. It's not the best game for that. It's okay, and part of the problem I feel is that each of the special enemies that you encounter has a very deliberate, very easy to figure out counter-attack. So, for example, if I'm fighting a mechanical unit, electricity attacks are obviously the way to go. If you're fighting against swarms of enemies, crows are the way to go. If you're fighting against things like the zealot or against the fireman, you just use bucking bronco and then shotgun. And all of those sort of hard counter things, I think, make it a little bit less interesting from a tactical perspective, as if you had more options that were more circumstantially useful. For example, maybe if you were fighting against a handyman or whatever, and you could use the water tentacle to push him off a cliff more often, I think that would be interesting tactically, because that would be much more sensitive to the situation you're in, or if there was more environmental kills maybe. But from a tactical combat perspective, I don't think Bioshock Infinite is the best. It's just very slow and methodical. Normal mode, I think, is the much better option in this particular game, where you get to be a swashbuckling sky pirate. So, lastly, the thing I want to talk about here is mechanics and story and how they meld together. This is a game that's been getting a lot of controversy or talk about things like ludonarrative dissonance, and as much as I hate that sort of term, as I think it's incredibly pretentious, it's that idea that there are gameplay elements that are in conflict with the story. And what's cited as being in conflict with the story in this particular case is a few things. One of the big things is that no matter what it is, you seem to solve everything you do with violence, and they seem to think that there should be more options to get out of combat or whatever, or there should be means to get out of a situation other than blasting your way out of it. Sorry, my throat was just getting a bit sore. Anyway, I think that it's a bit clearer to say that, again, because of who Booker DeWitt is. I think people are so used to playing games where the character is a specific person out with a specific goal, and that goal is very clearly defined and true to what you're being told, that they're uncertain about what the plot is sometimes, or the character is sometimes, when the character is well defined. In Booker's case, it's pretty obvious that he's going to solve all of these problems with violence, simply because that's who he is. And I don't really understand where they're coming from when they say that, the fact that you spend most of your time in the city fighting people, I don't particularly understand why they find that peculiar, given who you're playing as, what you're doing, or what you're up against. And it's that religious zealot and his literal police military force fighting against you. I mean, the people that you actually end up fighting are people that very reasonably should be fighting against every time they get a chance to fight you. So there isn't really much in the way of any sort of disconnect between the story and the narrative and the gameplay in regards to the fact that you're constantly fighting. Now, you can argue that they've decided to make Booker the person who he is, make Booker the character that he is, based on the fact that you're always fighting and not the other way around. I don't think that actually matters when discussing the narrative dissonance. All that matters is that what would make no sense is if Booker DeWitt decided to say, settle down, let's talk this over. But Booker DeWitt is a Han shot first kind of character. He's not the kind of person who dodges and then shoots back. He's the guy who just shoots the other guy in the face first. And I don't really understand why people are saying that that should be otherwise. Now, moving on from there, there is another one that people have been questioning, which is the presence of Vigors in Columbia and why they haven't turned it into Rapture yet, and or why they're there in the first place. Now, I'd agree to a certain extent that Vigors are only in the game because they want some sort of interconnectivity in the mechanics between the Bioshock games. I don't think that they're poorly justified in being there, however. The main mechanical conceit of the original Bioshock was in the plasmids, and they're pretty much the big thing in terms of mechanics. In this one, it's terrors, and while the terrors, I feel, could have been better represented a little bit, they could have had more options, they could have had more that you could do with them. One of the big things that they've done is discussed how that would affect the world, and it's the same as how the plasmids affected the world of Rapture. In Columbia, the terrors, most practical thing is that they've been used to steal technology, and Fink primarily uses the terrors to steal technology or to predict other technology or to look at other people's technology. That's what terrors can feasibly do, especially because the control of them is sort of shaky and only works in controlled areas. I think that the way they've handled that is fairly reasonable, and the sort of mechanical conceit of the game should be represented through pulling in mechanical conceits from other games. The thing is, they've only really ever made the original Bioshock, and they've also made System Shock. So when you're talking about stealing technology, it makes most sense for them to be stealing technology from Bioshock, which is exactly what they've gone ahead and done. They've stolen the Songbird, which is based off the design for the Big Daddy, and they've got the Vigors, which they've stolen from plasmids, and they've got that sort of whole idea by looking at Rapture, and they've sort of refined it for their own purposes. So I think that that's how that's affected the world. One of the interesting things is it's affected the world more directly through music than it has through the Vigors, because most of the music that they hear is stolen. On the other hand, Fink and his stolen Vigors, they don't catch on with the populace, and you can actually hear people talking about that. They think it's unnatural. They think it's quite tacky, and they think that anyone who uses it's sort of really kind of weirdo, and you actually see that in the game. The people who actually take this are functionally zealots in the service of Comstock. The firemen and the, actual zealots are all sort of extreme people who are willing to sacrifice body and soul for their ideals. The average person isn't going to do that. In fact, the way the average people use these Vigors is the way they're advertised by Fink. He didn't look at these in the way that they looked at it in Rapture. In Rapture, they thought, if you took this stuff, you could be a Superman above a human. Fink marketed them much more practically. Fink marketed, for example, the Devil's Kiss as something you could use to light up a dark corridor, or light a cigarette, or to light your fire. Those are very practical things that you see people in Columbia doing, and a lot of people complain that you don't ever see people using Vigors. Well, the problem is you don't actually ever really see people. They've all, for the most part, run the hell away from wherever the hell it is you're going, because you're a deranged lunatic who's killing everybody. So very reasonably, the only people you usually see are running away from you. Or they say, oh, Jesus, that guy, and try to get away. But there's evidence all over the place that people actually do use Vigors, and they leave it behind with them. They leave Devil's Kiss beside their cigar, or by their fireplace, or by their furnace. Or they leave the electro shock jockey beside the door locks that are run with the shock jockey. Or you see behind the counter bar, along with the shotgun, the Raven spell. So all those things sort of go into the world as something different than what they were used for in Rapture, and I think that it's strewn about in an interesting way because it's not overt. They don't explain it to you. They just sort of have it there, and it's up to you to interpret it that way. And it's possible that you can interpret it differently or just not interpret it at all. But that is actually, I think, what they're trying to show there, and I think that's done very brilliantly and very subtly. So, that's pretty much everything I need to say about this game. And if you haven't bought it yet, it does show up on Steam sales from time to time. So, if you're getting it for like $5, it's always definitely going to be worth a try for that. But if you feel that you're looking for a game that offers a unique sort of experience, one that's focused more around telling a story about a specific set of characters, as opposed to sort of just telling a story about events that happen in the world, to a specific character that could be anybody, this is a much more personal story. And I think if that's something that you've been looking for in games, this is a good game for you to grab. If you like the original Bioshock as well, this game isn't actually all that disappointing. There are a lot of elements that are very similar to the original Bioshock that carry over to this one and that are pretty much just as well done. And I think that you'll probably still enjoy this, even if a little bit less than the original Bioshock. So I think that this is a game that, if you haven't already picked it up, it's been out for quite a while now, you'll get it on sale. It's worth checking out. If it sounds like, everything I'm saying is stuff that you absolutely don't want to play, and obviously don't play it, that's fine. But I do think that if you've been looking for this sort of game, and Lord knows I want another game like this, there are just so few games that focus on the characters, and not just a free-form character that I invented, I just mean actual characters that, I'm getting kind of sick of the nameless characters that you get in games. So more games like this would be fantastic for me. Until then, I'm going to probably play this one more time just because it's a game that you get more details and you get a little bit more about the backstory and the lore and the world every time. So that's my stance on this game. And I hope you found this informative. And as always, I hope to see you all next time.